behalf of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences and the Buddhist Society of Victoria, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all and to our guests, our panelists today, Venerable Ajahn Brahm and Dr. Nicholas Van Damme. And I'm Dr. Lydia Brown, the moderator of today's event, titled Beyond Mindfulness, the Scientific Examination of Buddhist Practice. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, and I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. So I'll introduce the panelists that we're so grateful to have today. Before we get on with that and move into the discussion, I have a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, we will open the discussion up to questions from the audiences in about 40 minutes time or so. So I warmly encourage you to place any questions you might have into the chat box, and they'll be collated and we'll draw on some of those questions later on in the discussion. And also this event will be recorded and it will be available on our YouTube and social media channels. So hosted via the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. And I believe also it will be embedded through the Buddhist Society of Victoria communication channels as well. So that will be available in due course. So today we're here to explore what lies beyond mindfulness. So we're looking at how science can better understand contemplative practices originating from Buddhism and what broader Buddhist principles and practices might contribute to a life well lived above and beyond mindfulness. And also, if there is a role, we'll consider if science might have any role to play in enriching Buddhism. We might explore that as well. So to introduce our panelists. We're so honoured and fortunate to have Ajahn Brahm and Dr. Nicholas Van Damme here to explore this topic today. So Ajahn Brahm is the abbot of Bodhinyana Monastery in Western Australia. After graduating from a degree in theoretical physics at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, Ajahn became a Buddhist monk back in 1974 under the guidance of the renowned meditation master Ajahn Chah in Thailand. Ajahn Brahm is the author of a number of well-read books from around the world, including Opening the Door of Your Heart, and Mindfulness, Bliss and Beyond, and The Art of Disappearing. His public teachings are heard by millions of people online and in person. And in 2019, Ajahn Brahm was awarded the Order of Australia for his service to Buddhism and gender equality. And so we're very honoured and we welcome Ajahn Brahm to be here with us tonight. Dr. Nicholas Van Damme is a senior lecturer in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and he is highly regarded as a global leader in the field of contemplative research and practice. Nicholas holds a PhD in clinical psychology and has extensive training in cognitive neuroscience and mindfulness and meditation. Nicholas has research interests in mindfulness, anxiety, depression, decision-making, fMRI, psychometrics and assessment, and has been published in 55 academic publications that have been cited an impressive 4,440 times, probably more by now. Since relocating to Australia in mid-2017, Nicholas has been featured as lead scientist on the ABC's flagship science program, Catalyst, has been an expert contributor to Shannon Harvey's award-winning documentary, My Year of Living Mindfully, consulted for a special episode of ABC's Play School called Mindful Me, and has made several appearances on ABC and Radio National. So we're in very good company tonight. And I'll be guiding and moderating the discussion today. So to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Lydia Brown. I'm a clinical psychologist, and through my work as a psychologist, I translate Buddhist techniques grounded in mindfulness and compassion in a secular setting through my work as a therapist. I also hold a PhD in clinical psychology, and I've completed postdoctoral research fellowships at Harvard Medical School and the University of Melbourne. And my research explores the science and practice of cultivating positive mental states, especially self-compassion. And this work has been covered in the media around the world. I'm also the academic co-chair of the 17th Sakyadhita International Conference of Buddhist Women, which will take place in December of 2021. And through the Buddhist Society of Victoria, I've volunteered to coordinate 10-day silent residential meditation retreats taught by visiting Buddhist monastics. So that's a bit about us and where we come from and our roles. So really now I'd like to move into some questions. And while today's topic is looking at what lies beyond mindfulness, I think it's also important to start by defining what we actually mean by mindfulness and why it's been so incredibly popular in the wide secular world over the past 30 years. So maybe Ajahn Brahm, if we could start with you, why do you think mindfulness has just completely taken off and infiltrated our society on so many levels over the past 30 years?
I think one reason is because it's a skill which people can learn, and it empowers people to pursue that path of developing their mindfulness and see where it leads themselves. So it gives them personal responsibility, and also it does open up some really interesting areas of understanding how your mind works, how your emotions work. And if you can see what's happening inside, just like lifting the bonnet of a car up, you can see sometimes what's wrong and fix it up yourself. And of course, there's been much evidence of how that mindfulness does help people's lives. It's cheap, it's reliable, and it works.
Great, thank you. And Nicholas, what are your thoughts on what mindfulness is and why it's been taken up so widely in society?
I mean, I think defining mindfulness is something I sort of try to avoid doing just because it's incredibly complicated. I would imagine Ajahn Brahm would agree sort of that there's various interpretations in different texts and different traditions. The one particular definition that I've sort of seen recently that I like is this idea of a particular type of awareness arises that while you're paying attention. And the definition of the things that I often think of are there are qualities of discernment, so differentiating things that are adaptive from things that are maladaptive, and that there can be a intentional aspect to it. So, in a particular commitment and often an implication of memory. So a remembering to kind of be in the present. And I particularly like those ideas that have come along or been proposed by some particular authors. But it is incredibly difficult. Sort of some people vehemently disagree that memory is involved, some don't, some think it must be present moment centered, others don't. So it's a bit tricky. As to why it's grown in popularity, I think, as Ajahn Brahm has said, I think it's a simple technique. Most people, I think, connect with the idea of sort of, dropping in and sort of being more present and connecting with themselves and trying to understand their mind better. I also think for a number of people, the way in which these techniques have been promoted, particularly sort of in the West, in programs like mindfulness-based stress reduction, have offered people a way of empowering themselves to help with particular problems and reaching beyond what is sort of offered, particularly I think by Western medicine. So particularly problems like chronic pain or mental health conditions where the typical treatments haven't worked so well, or have worked and do work, but maybe just haven't given them quite the relief they want. And so I think a lot of people have found sort of solace in being able to do something on their own and to look further. The last thing I really think is, and this is something I think has been particularly true of people I've spoken with in the context of COVID, but I think people are looking for answers. I think, in many ways, as societies become more secular and science sort of has replaced to some extent the role that traditional religion has played, I think people are gravitating towards things like mindfulness and meditation to try to explore what everything means and to try to understand themselves and their world better. And so I think that that's a real part of it. Is it feels like there's a capacity in meditation and mindfulness to sort of start to explore some of these bigger questions. And people, I think, are just edging around kind of religion in various ways.
So you touched on exploring bigger questions, and Ajahn Brahm earlier touched on opening the bonnet of a car to see what's going on. Sometimes I think of mindfulness as not being very exploratory, seeing things as they are, but not necessarily doing anything about it. You know, you can open the bonnet of a car and it might be broken, but, you know, seeing that's not really going to fix the car. So I'm wondering, you know, does mindfulness, this is really a question for both of you, maybe starting with Ajahn Brahm, you know, is mindfulness just seeing things and not doing anything about them, or is there a kind of fixing or sort of transformative quality in mindfulness?
It's just by itself, when it starts you seeing what's happening out there. And also there's something which transforms when you practice mindfulness a lot, is your mindfulness increases in power, by which I mean you can see more, you can hear more deeply, and even your food tastes more delicious than it did usually. And it shows that you are actually waking up, that our sense of discernment is just very weak in most cases because we're very exhausted and tired. And as we do more mindfulness practices, that we find that it is like a waking up and energizing, a recharging the battery of your phone. So you can actually see more, you can hear more, you can discern more. And that is something which happens almost naturally as you become mindful, because you're not doing anything else. But there's another aspect of mindfulness, which you know I teach a lot, which is adding this very passive kindness to whatever you're doing. So it becomes kindfulness. So adding that kindness there, it's not really doing anything, it's just the way you're observing things with some compassion, with some care. And that is incredibly powerful, because that tends to relax, even like muscles in your body, so that whatever is needed to get to that part of the body which is wounded or has a tumor or something, that part can be healed. At least it can certainly get much better, simply because you're letting the body open up, relax from kindness, and also from the mindfulness. But even more than that, to actually understand the nature of what's happening in our life, when we're just going through a fog, and we can't see very far. We can't even see, the bottom of the ground where our feet are standing. But as the mindfulness increases in power, you see much more. And I was interested by some research which was done by the ABC and also the BBC as well in London, that they were noticing something called enhanced perception. And this was basically from people who'd been in solitary retreat for a long time, even like hermits. And they found that when they walked out of the little hermitage, even the wind was blowing. They could feel the wind, and it was magical because they could feel so much more of it. What they saw was brighter, that everything was like empowered. The same eyes, the same ears, the same physical touch, but now it was enhanced, empowered, and very exciting to be with. So that is sometimes I'm sorry, I have to quote this because this is one of my favorite quotes from William Blake of the 17th century: to see a world in a grain of sand, a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. It was an example of what enhanced perception is by a 17th century mystic and poet and artist as well. And that gives an idea where mindfulness can lead and where it goes into the spiritual, but also the innovative. So science can make great discoveries.
Nicholas, what does the research say about enhanced perception when it comes to, Ajahn Brahm touched on some research. What are your thoughts about the research in terms of enhanced perception that can arise from mindfulness?
Yeah, there's definitely some interesting evidence. I think one of the studies that kind of most influenced me in my thinking in this space, there was a paper in about 2007 that was done by Helene Slachter, who's in the Netherlands now, and who was working with Richie Davidson at the time. And there's a particular task where people are shown stimuli, so letters or numbers, very rapidly, and so you see them for a fraction of a second, and it goes on to the next one. And what happens is that there, within this stream of letters or numbers, there are targets, and you're supposed to identify these targets. And so there's this really interesting phenomenon where if the second target is really close to the first target, you miss it. So the effect is called the attentional blink. And the idea is that, or the original idea, I guess, was that there's some kind of fundamental bottleneck in attention, that humans in some ways can only process so much at a given amount of time. Now, what was fascinating about this study was that people who had been actively meditating, and in this case, I believe the main results were for people who had been on a 3-month retreat, they actually didn't show the same pronounced effects of this attentional blink. So their ability to detect that second target was much higher than comparison groups. And it's really fascinating. So this is sort of something that we sort of didn't really think. And there's a few of these studies where we haven't really thought this kind of thing was entirely possible or plausible. And the interpretation I really stands out to me as well. It was this idea that of mental stickiness, which I really like that idea, that we get stuck on particular things and we can't let go of them. And so the idea was, well, if you develop mindfulness and just a observing of what comes as it arises and as it passes, and you don't cling to anything, then you're able to kind of let go of that first stimulus and see the second one. So it's just this incredible study that I think really speaks volumes to the enhanced sort of attentional capacities. And really, I think the sort of ability, there's this really fascinating discussion when the study first came out in a couple of events with Mind and Life among a number of scientists and Buddhist monks and nuns about what this means. And sort of there was all this discussion about actually seeing moments of time kind of being strung together. So there is some interesting evidence to suggest that, that in certain forms and types of practice, that some of these capacities that have been talked about in traditional contexts can be cultivated.
And Ajahn, as a meditation practitioner, I'm not sure if you could estimate how many hours you might have spent in meditation over the course of your life so far.
That's a very hard one. I've been meditating. I was 46 years as a monk, actually, in a couple of days' time on my anniversary. But it's also a meditation about 5 years before that. I don't know how many hours a day. It's not a regular practice because sometimes you just meditate almost all day, and sometimes just a few hours a day. But heaps and heaps and heaps and heaps.
Well, I think tens of thousands of hours, including intensive retreats of really, withdrawing from the world and really meditating as a focus of life for, a number of months at a time. Yeah,
it's my life. It's what I do.
So as a dedicated, you've dedicated a lot of your life to this practice. How does Nicholas's, ideas of the research, in terms of seeing time slow down, seeing moment to moment more clearly than we might in normal life or than a non-meditator might, does that relate to your lived experience of meditation?
Only slightly. But it seems to be like more than that, because one of the things which happens when you do get enhanced perception, when the mindfulness really starts to take off, you get so much joy and happiness, bliss, ecstasy states. And those are some of those states which people could read about in sort of hermits of the Middle Ages, but they happen with hermits of the modern day, even here in Australia as well. You bliss out. And sometimes where does all that energy, all that joy come from? Of course, in Buddhism, we have these things called the Five Hindrances, like wanting, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry and doubt. All those things get discarded when you go into deep meditations and you come out afterwards. And without those, it's just what drags the mind down, what stops it being alive, alert, and being able to penetrate deeper than before is removed. But also the innovative quality of such a powerful mindfulness, where insights come from, is because the mind is powerful and it's also courageous as well. And it's so courageous you can see things which aren't supposed to be true. In other words, you can challenge just your learned views and the behavior which comes from it. makes you much more adaptable to different things in modern life, because you aren't so stuck with those "this is the way things are" ideas. One of the problems with usual definitions of mindfulness, the one which always I would like to argue against if I had the opportunity, was when it said non-judgmental awareness. There's always a judgment there when one is aware. It's just, how judgmental are you? And sometimes that we don't see those judgments. You know, sometimes the misogynism, the racism, the ethnocentrism which we have in our mind, it's almost just so deep in there. It's hard to actually even to see it, let alone eradicate it or get past it. One of the nice things which happens in meditation, the mindfulness gets so powerful, so aware, you can see so deeply. And some of the things you wouldn't like to see, you do see. But you've got the courage, the strength, the sense of safety and poise that you can let it be seen and you can go past it.
I mean, these things sound quite profound. And from the research perspective, often used as a gold standard is mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is an 8-week mindfulness course. It's thought to be quite intensive. I think it is about 40 hours or so of meditation practice. This is sort of deemed a gold standard to look at efficacy of mindfulness for people in the general population. But the things you're talking about, you know, I'm not sure if we'd be able to measure those through, you know, asking people to attend an 8-week course, you know, or might an individual who joins an 8-week course and commits to, you know, daily practice, might they touch on some of the things you're talking about, or is this more the deeper states of meditation that come through more extensive practice?
It is amazing just how many just ordinary people can actually touch on such amazing experiences in their meditation. And again, as soon as you start talking about measurement, that is one of those words which, you know, as a monk, I rebel against. As a scientist, you have to measure in order to find out where you are. But the idea of measuring things rather than allowing things to be free, because measurement is a form of control, or at least a controlling. That's Lord Kelvin's famous saying. Lord Kelvin, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if you want to control nature, you have to learn how to measure, he said, measure her accurately first. And so from measurement, we get control. And so sometimes, is science really trying to measure things and control things? Or is it just a free investigation just to see what happens? Instead of trying to prove something, just to discover things.
Nicholas, I think this, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts sort of related to that, which just sort of some of what we've been discussing. I think one is, I guess, I would wonder sort of in the context of individuals experiencing joy and bliss in states of that nature, how common that is. I'm certain that it happens, and I'm certain that it happens a reasonable amount. I guess the thing that I also wonder about is the opposite side, and I'd be curious to hear from the Buddhist context, you know, what the sort of approaches to that. So, you know, people that go into states of sort of deep confusion or dissociation, or really struggle sort of with their sense of self. And, you know, they've been sort of been likened to the dark nights, which, you know, as I understand it, is not actually, or at least I've been told, is not the most appropriate translation, or not the most appropriate context, because it's about Christian practice. But the analogy stands nonetheless, which is sort of these paths that sort of feel very dark. And, you know, I guess in the traditional context, you feel as if you're in the absence of God now. But in this context, it's more of, you know, things are going quite badly. So I guess that there is a part of me that sort of is always cautious and sort of feeling as if we need to be clear with people that those are also possible. And I personally don't think that those are just sort of people dealing with mental health issues. There's evidence of people sort of, you know, without a history of mental health sort of experiencing these kinds of states. The issue of measuring these sort of things, I think, is incredibly challenging, and I think there is some truth to that, you know, in the sense of I mean, a number of people pointed out sort of in more recent sort of advances in science that, and you know, we're slow to acknowledge this, I think, in particular areas, say like psychology or neuroscience, but you know, in contemporary physics, there's a real recognition that the observer, you know, that is the scientist, is influencing the thing they're measuring, right? So that's the classic sort of Schrodinger's cat, right? Until you open the box, the cat is both alive and dead. And it's the process of actually opening the box that essentially kills the cat or lets the cat live. And this is sort of the complexity of quantum mechanics. And I think we in sort of contemporary, as I mentioned, neuroscience, psychology, and other areas, we haven't quite figured that out yet, or we haven't quite figured out how to make sense of that, that in the process of observing things, we're potentially altering them. And part of the altering is, to go back to the kind of non-judgment comment, or the fact that there is no non-judgment, that there's always some judgment. We're also, as researchers, influencing that by our own biases. And I think that's part of why it's so important for us as academics and scientists and clinicians to be aware of our own biases. I think ultimately, I think, you know, many people, I think, want to be able to measure things. I don't know if it's ultimately if it's to control it. Personally, my interest in measuring or trying to measure these things is not, I don't think it's control. It's more, for me, it's a curiosity, but it's a different kind of curiosity than I think the exploration of what happens for yourself. You know, when you practice for yourself and you're sort of just open to whatever arises, it's a different type of curiosity. It's a different type of openness that is not necessarily constrained by preconceived ideas. Whereas I think when you're coming at it from a scientific perspective, the challenge is essentially, and this has happened in some discussions I've had with people from Thich Nhat Hanh's organization recently, it can be very difficult to let go of scientific preconceptions, as it were. So, you know, as a scientist, you kind of have to adhere to, well, there's particular principles of science that have configured the way that I think about the world and make sense of the world. And I have to, in essence, build on that understanding to make sense of what's happening now. And there are certain realizations or observations that may cause me to sort of abandon some of the prior work as a scientist, but it would be rare as a scientist that you could sort of say, I'm going to abandon all of my prior work. Not saying it's impossible, I'm just saying that's sort of often how we operate. I do think we need to be a lot more creative, though, in terms of how we measure things. I think, you know, particularly sort of scanning people's brains when we're looking at particular states or experiences, is probably the wrong place. You know, I think some of these states or experiences, you know, there's probably a lot that's really interesting going on in the brain, but I ultimately don't think we're going to pinpoint bliss or, you know, something like enlightenment in the brain. I just, you know, I think that we're looking in the wrong place. And so I think we can get a lot more creative. I don't know, you know, whether we're talking about sort of these sort of states of, you know, extreme joy or bliss or things like that. I'm not entirely sure where we do look, but I think one of the places we could look would be in the world. And this is something that I think is really important. We look at the flow-on effects of the individual on those around them. So I think we could start to see that. And that's not something as scientists we often do. We're often, particularly Western science, we're often very focused on the self and the individual. And so we're asking the individual who's meditating what's going on for them. And I think we could be looking around them. If we ask their partner or their best friend or their coworkers, you know, well, what's going on with this person? And I suspect if there was really these kind of joyous and bliss states, the partner would say, actually, you know what, they're a lot nicer. And so I think that's the kind of work that we should really be considering.
Excellent.
What are your thoughts, Ajahn Brahm? Yeah, I mean, to do research creatively, what do you think of Nicholas's idea? What are your ideas in terms of how scientists can progress despite the limits of science?
Yes, I mean, it's just that it's a great innovative idea of doing the research not on the person themselves, but just on the people they work with and the people they live with, and just a bit of a long term over many, many days, and just to see how it enhances just their research papers which they have to write, and the work they do in the office, and just the way they can live harmoniously and ethically, you know, with their families. And I think that happiness quotient it's very hard for you to know how you grow yourself. But other people who live with you, who see you, then they can actually get a much more accurate description of how you've improved or how you've not improved, and what you say about yourself. So that's a very innovative way of tracking things rather than measuring things, because again, these things never are stable. They grow, they stabilize, or they decline. And it's to see the long-term results, also very, very important. But just that one little thing which Nicholas mentioned, which I want to bring up, is the dangers of mindfulness meditation, where people do get into some very sort of very difficult states of mind. And I think a lot of that is coming from adding the internal tension of trying to achieve something, trying to get somewhere, and doing a mindfulness intense practice. The whole idea of intense meditation practice is something which is foreign to me. And you've been on my retreats, you know what I'm talking about, that sometimes when a person is tired, you go to bed, have a sleep. They don't have to meditate. There's no compulsion there. So the meditation becomes something which is natural for them, which they eat when they're hungry. They meditate when they want to be peaceful. They never force themselves. And that type of kindness and that sense of freedom enhances mindfulness.
Reminds me of, I was surprised when coming to your retreat center, there were a lot of teddy bears in the meditation. And I thought, what's meditation and teddy bears have to do with each other? So can you help everybody understand why mindfulness and teddy bears have anything to do with each other?
Yes, please excuse the bad joke, but it's bear awareness. Teddy bear awareness. But no, that actually came from one of the Buddhist monks over here in Australia, Ajahn Sujato, who left us his teddy bear as a kid. And it went from one teddy bear to hundreds of teddy bears there. And because people put them on their lap when they're meditating, cuddle them, and it gives them a wonderful feeling of safety. Of course, they don't have to do that. It's an opportunity for them. But it gives them a sense of something to cuddle, something which is warm, something which will generate kindness towards themselves from an object which is totally non-threatening. And that assists people to relax their body, relax their mind, so the mindfulness can really work. So that's why we have the teddy bears there, and they really work.
Yeah, I actually have one in my room now. It's behind me, and yeah, it's an interesting technique that does seem to bring a degree of friendship and kindness into a meditation practice.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask both of you about the role of time versus mindfulness, and perhaps it links to what Nicholas was talking about, mindfulness, and if there's a memory component there. Because sometimes when I think about mindfulness, I think about paying attention fully to the present moment. But often when I work with my clients, they have issues arising from the past, be it, significant trauma. Perhaps they've made a terrible mistake in their past that they just truly can't forgive themselves for. Or one friend of mine recently during lockdown, her daughter died unexpectedly, not from COVID, but in that context. These are huge life events. And, I'm wondering, is there a role for mindfulness, or is there a role for other aspects of Buddhism to support people heal from the past and work through these kind of traumas and life events that can happen as part of life?
Well, I'll start from there, that just adding the kindfulness and the mindfulness together. So that actually has had some huge effects. Again, by being innovative, you already mentioned one of the books which I wrote was called Opening the Door of Your Heart. And that was being used by a group of clinical psychiatrists over in Perth to marvelous effects on survivors of torture and trauma who've come into Australia as refugees. And what they have done, it surprised me that they adapted this and it works so well. They imagine a little heart in their chest. When they feel safe, the right time cannot be forced. They can always stop whenever they feel like it. A little door in their heart. And inside that heart is that person which they respect and love and are comfortable with, that part of you which you have no problems with at all. But then they open that door and they say outside, it's just a metaphor, but it helps, is that a young woman who was badly treated, who was raped, boy who was beaten, the person was just very badly treated. And it's outside of you. And what these people have done, and I was just so impressed with the results, they imagine a ladder going out of their heart to the outside, and they invite these parts of them inside their heart. They no longer try and get rid of these people. and pretend they didn't existed. That trauma is real. And they come in and they hug one another. They reconcile. And so that trauma is not forgotten, but it is transformed. They're not afraid of it anymore. They're not themselves stigmatizing what happened to them in the past. And that's a powerful experience. And seeing and talking with some of the people who have gone through that and come out the other side, they are at peace. And they tell other people what happened to them. And when they're asked, but it's no longer a burden on them at all. It's no longer a emotional deformity they're afraid of. And when you see that, you see that's a tremendously innovative way of dealing with the traumas of the past.
What happens if it's an individual themselves who's made, a mistake they just can't forgive themselves for?
They see that outside themselves. They see that little person who made a bad decision, and they come inside. And a lot of times, a bad decision, they think they've made a bad decision. When they come closer to it, they realize it's not as nowhere near as huge as when they just try and keep it out. They try and think it never happened. That's what makes it grow very, very big. It comes inside and they hug it. They find it's not that big after all.
Nicholas, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah, I hear a couple of themes that I sort of would like to pick up on, both from some previous comments and from this. One is, I think that the process of practicing in meditation has to be an invitation. It can't be a forcing.
Right.
And I think that the teachers and the monastics who do this well, do it that way. It's inviting yourself to experience things and giving yourself permission to feel certain ways, as opposed to trying to make yourself feel certain ways. And I think that's incredibly important, because I feel like the struggle to try to sort of struggle against or feel a particular way, or to force yourself to have a certain experience, is often, I think, what results in people kind of intensifying that experience, to sort of experiencing something that they don't want to, or what however you might think of it. Another thing that sort of really kind of jumps out at me, and something that came up for me sort of with earlier comments, was the place of the sort of additional packaging, if you speak, that comes along with, say, something like mindfulness. So I think the analogy that I've sort of talked about a lot with a lot of people sort of is this idea of a sniper. And if you were to just teach a sniper mindfulness, you'd make the sniper a really good sniper, right? And so I often sort of say, well, think about what it is that a sniper needs to do to do their job. They need to be very aware of their body. They're very aware of their breath. They're aware of their equipment. They're aware of their environment. They're aware of all the ways in which subtle bodily movements, thoughts, the wind, shifts in the wind, the bullet, how the cleanliness of the gun, all of these things will impact what it is that they're doing. And by many definitions, people would say, well, that sounds a lot like how people describe mindfulness. But ultimately, the end act is to kill someone. And then that's where I think essentially, so without those additional qualities or characteristics, you're really losing something. Without the characteristics that typically go along, thinking about ethics and pro-social capacities, and sort of doing this for a particular reason, I think you're really missing something. You're really missing the mark. And that's where I think is the real danger in some of these things, is that if we're not aware of those other practices or those other aspects of the practice, that what we're training is, essentially just more focused people, without necessarily giving them the opportunity to kind of build on that towards something bigger, better, and actually sort of fulfilling that kind of well-being or flourishing component. And so I think that's where, thinking about, well, there has to be an element of kindness to it. And Ajahn Brahm, in some of your books, you talk about how, and many sort of people talk about how when you're really struggling with, say, a basic mindfulness practice, it's the perfect time to sort of maybe shift to something like a loving kindness practice. If you're really feeling down or things feel dark, that's when those practices can be a huge help. And I would agree. And I think, clinically, in my experience as well, that Sometimes it needs to be clear when you do mindfulness, and sometimes it needs to be clear when you pull in things like loving kindness or self-compassion. The final thing I would say, which I think is really interesting in this context about, say, someone who's really struggling to forgive themselves, and I would draw heavily here on, say, what we often do in psychotherapy and how we think about these concepts from, particularly, say, the way that Aaron Beck or Albert Ellis, who sort of are some of the fathers or founders of cognitive behavioral cognitive therapy, talked about it, which is that this idea, and it's very, very Buddhist in a way as well, that the idea of self is an impermanent one. It's a story we tell ourselves. It's a narrative. And my favorite, this is a book chapter by the philosopher Daniel Dennett, and I love the title of the chapter because it's called "The Self as the Center of Narrative Gravity," and I just love the title. It's this beautiful sense of like the self, the story that we tell ourselves, sort of, this is sort of gravity that pulls the narrative towards this idea of ourself. And so I think about, the story of, someone who can't forgive themselves. They think they made a terrible definition. That's this idea that there's this constant permanent self that doesn't change. And I think that's part of the problem, is that, if you see yourself as this constant permanent thing that continues to exist in the same way always, then that's the thing you blame. If you can recognize that the self is an impermanent narrative and that we're influenced by all these different conditions, and that sometimes we make good choices and sometimes we don't, then it's a little bit easier to recognize that, well, in that particular circumstance, there were lots of things going on, and that self is different than this self. And that's true every moment, right? I mean, I think there's some fascinating sort of findings in the context of physics. I think, I think in one of John Kabat-Zinn's books, he pointed out that how, given the turnover of atoms in our body, every 7 years, our body is comprised of entirely new atoms. So every 7 years, basically from the atomical perspective, we're an entirely different person, which is just a really sweet or a nice way of sort of saying, yeah, like we're constantly changing, we're constantly evolving, and the self that you are right now is not the self that you used to be. And I think once you can come to embrace that idea, it's a little bit easier to forgive, because who you're forgiving or who you're accepting is not really it's not you, it's past you, who was doing the best that they could in the circumstances they were in.
Exactly. It's also just to understand that self will never be perfect. It makes mistakes. And that mistakes are where we learn. If we didn't have mistakes, we'd learn nothing in life. And so we accept, as the simile I usually give is the trees in the forest. I'm a forest monk, I live in forests. So I've never yet seen a perfect tree, one which is dead straight with no limbs broken off or no damage from the storms or the fires. In fact, my favorite trees are the ones which are most bent and twisted. The imperfect ones are the beautiful ones. So you don't have to be perfect to be loved.
I often say that to clients as well when I've worked clinically, that I think, if everyone was perfect and everyone sort of was straight, and how boring would the world be, right? It is the imperfections that make us interesting.
Yeah. You'd be out of a job. Me too.
Exactly, yes.
So from both a psychology perspective and a Buddhist perspective, a life well lived is not about being perfect. It's not about avoiding mistakes. So what is a life well lived?
It's about admitting mistakes, being honest to them, learning from them, growing from them, and sharing them with others. This is mistakes. If we all shared our mistakes, the stupid things we've done today, then there'd be hardly many people would think, oh yeah, that's me, I'm like that. And they would find out that they won't get so lost in the delusion of a self which has to be perfect.
And Nicholas, what would you say? What is a life well lived?
Yeah, I think, similarly, sort of my son was coming to give me a hug, so.
Life well lived.
The joys of working from home. But look, it's, I think it at the end of the day, again, I sort of think of Thich Nhat Hanh, a particular definition sort of about how, or a particular quote that he stated about how we miss the opportunities of happiness that are in front of us because we have a particular idea, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, a particular idea of happiness in mind. So in essentially in chasing the definition of happiness that we seek, we miss opportunities for happiness. And that is to say, we think that we have to be a particular way, or we think that we have to live a particular way, or we have to have particular things or a particular circumstance. And so when we define things that way, we cannot ever, by definition, be comfortable or happy with things just as they are. And I think that if we allow ourselves the freedom to be imperfect, if we give ourselves that permission, and as Ajahn Brahm said, we give ourselves permission to be authentic and acknowledge our mistakes, and maybe try to make a few less of them, even though we know we're going to continue to make them, then I think we really can live a meaningful life. I think it's about that authenticity and about that connection and being real in front of other people and not feeling like we need to be something we're not, which is fake. And if you think about sort of the reality that the self is not a consistent entity that will, it's not permanent, it's not unchangeable. And if you embrace that, then this becomes so much easier, in the sense that, of course, this is going to change, and every moment is a new opportunity for me to have another go, for me to try again, and I can learn from my mistakes, and I can grow, and I can try to do better. But I would also say, I think at the end of the day, for me, it's fundamentally about contentment, as opposed to happiness or bliss. I think happiness and bliss are wonderful, but I think when you're aiming for happiness and bliss, then you sort of, you're often shooting for something that maybe sometimes outside of your reach. And so if you're always wanting contentment or bliss, then by definition, again, there will be a lot of times that you can't be happy or can't be comfortable with where you are.
Maybe one thing to add to a life well lived is the idea of contribution. While we can look inwards and find peace within ourselves, I think great meaning arises through contributing and connecting to the world around us, be it even chatting with your neighbours or contributing to the world in ways big or small. And Ajahn Brahm, I think that you're an expert in that. While Theravada Buddhism doesn't really promote the Bodhisattva principle of really valuing the well-being of others to quite a profound level, and the sacrifice or energy that takes, I think that this is something more from Tibetan Buddhism, but I think seeing the way you live your life, it actually, the Bodhisattva principle kind of resonates. So I'm not sure if you can comment on that.
Yes, I'm a fraud. I'm not really Theravada. I'm just Buddhist. I don't see those differences between Theravada and Mahayana. And so the Bodhisattva is just obvious. If you love yourself, you love other people. If you're at peace with yourself, you'll spread that peace to others. And the kindest thing you could ever do for other people is to be kind to yourself. You don't see the difference between the two. Which is, that old story of when I give wedding blessings, I tell the new wife, from that moment on, you mustn't think of yourself. The husband, you mustn't think of yourself. You're a married man now. And then tell the husband, and from this moment on, please don't think of your wife ever again. From this moment on. And tell the wife, you must not think of your husband from this time on. Now you're married. Don't think of yourself. Don't think of your partner. Only think of us. You're in it together. So we're in it together. Sort of Australians, people of the world, human beings, animals, the whole lot. We're in this together. So you never think of yourself. You think of us. Different way of looking, but I find it very useful. Much more helpful in having a good relationship with your family and with the people you know and love and care for, and even people you haven't met before. It's all about us. This Bodhisattva or Theravada, I don't know, but it makes sense to me.
Loving yourself and loving others as if there's no boundary or no real distinction between the two.
Exactly.
I think that there's a risk in some of the Western approaches to mindfulness and meditation, which is that some of the approaches are very much about enhancing or promoting the oneself, right? They can be about performance or individual enlightenment. And I think, if there's a true recognition that you as an individual are fundamentally connected to everyone else in the world in which we live, then I think that it just sort of goes without saying that, anything you do for yourself or anything, you do for others will influence, it bidirectionally. So I think fundamentally when we take up this kind of practice, or when we take up any kind of practice, really, we ought to be thinking about what it does for those around us. What's the good that we can do? And sometimes by or many times I should say, if not all the time, by making ourselves better, we can be making the world better. But I guess if it's sort of a sole focus on our own gain, then we're perhaps not thinking about how we could be doing greater good in the broader world.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to shift to some questions from the audience, although I feel like we could just talk for hour after hour. There's just so much to cover. I've got all these questions of mine we haven't covered, but that's fine. So this is a question from the audience. When diving a little deeper into meditation, I was surprised to find how complex things get. For example, the 8 jhanas, cessation, stream entry. This stuff is never mentioned in popular approaches to meditation. So why has the field in popular or scientific circles been so narrowly shared? Or why is these aspects of Buddhism been so narrowly shared with the public?
I suppose that's a comment for me, or
for either. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm sure Ajahn Brahm has got his position on this, and I'm very curious to hear it. I think in the scientific perspective, I suspect part of this is a function of what's fundable, in the sense that what can we get support from traditional sort of scientific agencies to support. I suspect it's also a function, to some extent, of the interests of the researchers. So I think particular areas of meditation practice have been focused on by individuals who have sort of allegiance or commitment to a particular school of meditation. So I think that there is an element of, people really promoting kind of a narrow sense of ideas. I do think that there is a broadening of that. So there's people that are trying to look outside of this sort of small set of practices or ideas. So there is a growing interest in broader practices and ideas outside of just, singular definitions of mindfulness or singular types of meditation practice. But I guess the very practical issue is that some of these things, as we've sort of already alluded to, are harder to sort of explore in a traditional scientific framework. And I think that's also another reason, is that some of these states or practices are less amenable to traditional scientific inquiry, as it were. That's not to say I don't think we should do it. I absolutely do think we should. It's just you have to be, as we've sort of already discussed, you have to be a lot more creative in the way that you do it. And I think there are people sort of who are potentially not so prepared to be so creative because, there's sort of ways in which, as an academic, you may be risking elements of your career by sort of being very creative in the sense that you may not get funded.
Yeah, indeed. And just to let you know, that I do travel around a lot, and I speak to Buddhists of many different traditions. And for many years in Vietnam, they have a united Buddhist tradition there of Mahayana and Theravada in the south. And that they made a decision some years ago, which has been overturned now, thank goodness, to ban all the monks and the nuns from teaching jhanas to people. They thought it was going to be just too difficult, too problematical. So I said, no, let's keep this inside amongst ourselves. And even myself and many other people who started teaching those things got a lot of criticism from others saying, no, don't do this, don't teach this. But of course, being a rebellious scientist from Cambridge, he said, no, why not? Let's give it a try. And of course, we're doing that. And some people, surprisingly, can press the right button and get into these deep states. But what's happened now is that because the word is out there, these jhanas, stream reading and stuff is really useful. So many people are just trying to get these things. And even on a much smaller scale than mindfulness, even like jhana states, becoming a little minor industry within Buddhism. And some of the things which people say are jhanas are certainly not. It's a bit of a worry. But we'll see how that turns out in the future.
Thank you. And this is a question for Ajahn Brahm. Can mindfulness help us get out of addictions?
Indeed, it's one aspect. You can't sort of put all your eggs in that one basket of mindfulness, but certainly it can. It seems to be that this is from my experience, that sometimes people don't want to get out of addictions because they've got a very bad sense of self-love. In other words, that loving kindness seems to be much more effective to get out. So it's to start getting out of the addictions which one has. The idea of like caring for yourself, loving yourself. So I'd rather be give a person with an addiction a teddy bear, and to be able to hug that for a while and to learn to love themselves and realize you don't need to hurt yourself with these bad addictions. You're worth much more than that. That's just in brief.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Nicholas, are there any differences or similarities between cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness?
Well, I guess both cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness sort of are broad churches at present. So I think the difficulty sort of in saying that is that yes and no is my answer, or it depends. But yes, I mean, look, the reality I think is that if you're talking about mindfulness sort of as influenced by certain sort of aspects within the Buddhist tradition, or so say for example mindfulness within mindfulness-based stress reduction, or mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or in the way in which certain Buddhist traditions practice. And if you're thinking about cognitive behavioral therapy in the way that it sort of was proposed by Aaron Beck or Albert Ellis, then absolutely. And in fact, Albert Ellis, in sort of one of the last books he wrote before he died, talked very much about how mindfulness is quite compatible with cognitive behavioral approaches. So in many ways, I think there's this idea of how to approach the sense of self, how to explore one's thoughts, how to explore one's emotions, how to relate to them. There are similarities sort of in terms of how you can approach that. In certain cases, they depart, I think, in certain circumstances where it comes to sort of what to do with those experiences. So certain aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy would suggest that you should challenge those ideas, or that you should sort of try to replace them or change them in some way. I think my particular sense is that the approach in mindfulness-based approaches or meditation-based approaches, it's much more subtle. It's much more of an awareness of those experiences, a real sort of invitation, or sort of a effort to understand them. And this is something I kind of was thinking about earlier on, but I didn't say, that Stephen Batchelor had sort of in his 2015 book had sort of translated the Fourfold Noble Path and the Eightfold Noble Truths, and I particularly liked the way that he had translated them. So he translated the Fourfold Noble task as a task, and he translated it as embrace life, let go of what arises, see it ceasing, and act with an exclamation mark. So I really liked that last bit of act. And that was something that I thought of earlier when we were talking about this idea of, how can mindfulness be helpful? And I think there's a level of it generating insight, but it's the action on that insight that I think is particularly important. Now, at the end of the day, I think, again, sort of, I think there would be disagreements about, is just being aware of the extent of the problem and really coming to understand it, is that sufficient? Or do you actually have to do something about it to change it? And I think that's where sort of various psychotherapeutic traditions and Buddhist traditions part ways individually, like within themselves, but also sometimes with respect to one another.
And I'd add, from my practice, my most of my work is clinical practice, but I am also engaged with research. And I find cognitive behavioral therapy is a really great framework, but something I often try to enrich that with is the self-compassion, because a lot of people who come to see a psychologist, they're suffering in some way, shape or form, and learning skills to not only see that suffering but relate to it with kindness and compassion, in a way that you might treat a friend who is going through a hard time. For me personally, it's an idea that really resonates, and it can really cause quite profound shifts for people. And in a way, it links with a cognitive challenge, because you might be holding some negative view of yourself, and you start to not just cognitively but also emotionally challenge that, or think, well, hang on, is there another way to see this problem? Is there another way to relate to my own suffering? And often I think compassion or self-compassion can sort of be a bit of a tool to activate that. To continue with some of the questions, let's have a look. I have clients who say they are terrified of meditation. They try it and had panic attacks. So I believe this is a psychologist asking the question. Is there any advice? So maybe from Ajahn Brahm, you know, that these clients say they prefer distraction techniques. So should the psychologist, you know, what are your thoughts on those who are terrified of meditation and have panic attacks?
Yes, well, I'm not sure why people would be terrified of meditation, what type of meditation they're doing. Obviously, I would try and adapt the meditation. So it is so invitational, it is kind, it's soft, get out whenever you want. And you have the opportunity to actually to ask yourself, ask your mind, ask your body, what do you want? What do you need? And ask your body that. And if the body says, no, I don't want to do this, then fine, get up, do something else. So when a person is ready to do this, then they can. And you know, you're sitting next to them or close to them to support them at any time, whatever they need. And so I'm not quite sure where they get that idea of panic from. It's there's obviously something which is something they've heard or something that they've tried before or something which is threatening them. Find out that first of all and just deal with that, because meditation itself is not threatening at all. It's so peaceful, so loving, so kind. It's as dangerous as a stuffed cuddly teddy bear. So I can't really answer that until you get so much more information about why, what type of meditation they're doing.
I mean, it's a particularly, I think, interesting problem, I would say, because I think a lot of people hear mindfulness or meditation and they just assume it's like one thing, it's monolithic.
Yeah.
And it happens a lot, I think, in clinical practice, or, you know, and I've talked to a lot of people where they're sort of, you know, they're adamant that they have to do a practice, or they're adamant that they have done something. And they'll say, oh, I've done mindfulness, I've tried meditation. And I ask them what they did, and they'd say, you know, oh, I tried out this app to do this thing, and, you know, this is what happened. And then they'll describe it to me. I'll say, that's not meditation. That's not mindfulness. That sounds like a, you know, a health app. You know, it's nice, like you visualize fluffy clouds, but I do wonder, I think, you know, one thing that sort of often comes to mind, I think for me, is that people are not necessarily aware of kind of what, you know, a lot of people sort of are unaware of various issues or various things in their past. So they haven't really explored what is sort of feeling their state or their condition. And so I think maybe from a psychological perspective, I think some of the scariness of the process of sitting down in meditation is that people are, if you're trying to avoid re-experiencing things or exploring things in depth, my experience in meditation, which pales in comparison obviously to Ajahn Brahm's, but my experience sort of is that, you know, many of those things that you kind of are not wanting to deal with come to mind. And if you're not really prepared for that, I think that can, for some individuals, I think that can create fear. But I would say sort of, I would wholeheartedly endorse this idea. If you're doing it and inviting in a warm and a generous way, and if you're listening to the body and you're trying to understand, well, what is it that the body needs, and as an individual, what is it that individual needs, then and you're not trying to force a particular practice, then, you know, I don't see how, you know, how that sort of would necessarily go kind of pear-shaped as quickly as people might think.
Yes, indeed. One little anecdote, there was one girl once who came on one of my courses, and she was so depressed, so fed up, and she wanted to leave. And so just wait a moment, please. And I gave her on nice letterheaded notepaper in Gothic script the first unhappy license. I said, this license gives you permission to be unhappy at any time for any reason throughout the whole retreat and even afterwards. Signed, your teacher, Ajahn Brahm. And that was the end of her unhappiness. She was free to be, and she wasn't trying to be something she wasn't. And she was smiling for the rest of the whole retreat. And those unhappiness licenses are very popular.
Maybe we should be handing those out in psychotherapy. What do you think, Lydia?
You go to psychotherapy to try and get healed. I said, no, it's not about being cured, it's about being cared for.
How would you explain the difference between attention and awareness?
Who's going to answer that one?
Well, I mean, I can say it from sort of what my thinking from a sort of neuroscience psychological perspective is. So, I mean, I think they're fundamentally intertwined, but I think, you know, when it really comes down to it, the idea of awareness is sort of peripheral. So it's, you know, what sort of, you can be aware of something without being attentive to it. I'm not entirely sure you can attend something without being aware of it. So in other words, you may be aware of things going on in your periphery and your background, but they're not the main sort of point of your focus. Whereas attention really, I think, is what it is that you're kind of concentrating on, or is the main object of your mind, if you will. So to me, that's the key from the sort of psychological perspective. That's the key distinction. Awareness can be very broad, and it can be the same thing as what you're attending, whereas attention sort of is where you're directing kind of your mind's eye or your sort of focus.
Very good.
Got another question, maybe to start with you, Ajahn Brahm. Well, it's really for both of you, but we'll start with you, Ajahn. Karma. So this is a part of Buddhism that really has not been understood, you know, that scientifically. Is this something that as scientists we should be exploring, the Buddhist concept of karma?
Well, why not? Because there's two parts to karma. And first of all, the karma is from the past is what gives you the ingredients of now. This is like the hand you're dealt. But you pick the cards out, or you chose those cards. The most important part of karma is what you do with what you have. In other words, how you play that hand, which you have in front of you. And instead of thinking, oh, why have I got these cards? Why did I get this bad deal? This is really terrible. No, you can always make something out of whatever you have. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't matter just if a person is wealthy or poor, or is intelligent or not so intelligent, beautiful or ugly, or whatever it is they have in their life. It's how they play their hand. That's the most important part of karma, the active part rather than the passive part. So, you may have some people come to you with all sorts of problems from the past. That's the past karma. You did something wrong to your kid. You can't undo that. But now, how can you deal with that right now? How can you learn from that? And please excuse me, it's just a very intense example. There was this one woman who had been very, very badly raped. This was over in Malaysia. And she was very difficult to deal with that because it's why did this happen to me? And to be able to give her some meaning, so that terrible bad karma which she had to deal with, now how can you make something good of that? And I said, look, you can in the future do something I will never be able to do. From your own experience, you know what it feels like. I don't want to know what it feels like, and I can't know what it feels like, but you can actually become an amazing sort of psychologist, teacher, healer, carer, because you've been there. You know what it's like. And that ability to connect with somebody else, you will have that, where I will never have that. And actually that gave her a meaning, something she could work on to make some good karma out of that really gross karma, that terrible hand she was dealt. To give life some meaning. And sometimes when people are really depressed, really even some sort of suicidal, anxious, why? Sometimes that works. This is a karma from your past or whatever. Sometimes it just happened. I don't know. Some things are not karma. But anyway, whatever it was, now it's here. And make use of it, if you possibly can.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about scientifically, but it's certainly something I feel I see from a secular perspective and work as a psychologist, is that people come often bearing many things from the past, which is sort of like the past living in the present and clouding the present. But through therapy and through talking and through thinking and reflecting, that past is understood differently and is made sense of, made peace with. And in a sense, that's a type of letting go of the past, or you could say letting go of karma, to free up the present moment to live more fully in the here and now.
Yeah.
And I think by this definition, we fundamentally do. I think we study karma quite a lot. I think, and particularly in psychotherapy, I think we just don't call it that.
Yeah.
Where we've only got a few minutes left, so it's probably, I haven't quite got through all of the questions, and we've got a bit of housekeeping to do at the end, but I'm not sure if anybody has any final comments about maybe future directions. We have the scientists on one side, we have a scientist, psychologist, we have the Buddhists on another side. What does the future look like? How can we collaborate, not just with each other, but with other faiths, other traditions, other perspectives, especially in this interconnected world that we live in more than ever, with global challenges like the COVID pandemic and global warming? This is such a big question. Maybe it's unfair to ask such a big question, but, what are the next steps? Where to from here beyond mindfulness? Ajahn.
Okay, you put me on the spot. Basically, I just do not know, and it just I've apologized to the monks and the people on our Buddhist Society, West Australia and Victoria. I'm supposed to be advising and leading, but I don't really have, honestly, a lot of plans for the future. It just little by little, stage by stage, just like little pot plant. There's a pot plant behind you. It just grows day by day. It never has any big plans on what it's going to do in the future. And I like that idea of just growing organically and letting mindfulness, letting science not have these great plans of what they're going to do, where they're going to reach in the future. But let's just take one day at a time, present moment, and just see what we can do today to make a little bit of a better world, and just move it up from there.
Perhaps to draw on the analogy, I think, fundamentally as pot plants, we have to plant seeds. Otherwise, nothing grows. And so I think, we, particularly in these giant, international global problems that we face, we have to plant seeds towards something bigger. We have to plant seeds towards working together. I think one of the biggest things we can do is genuinely listen to each other. And I think some of the things that Ajahn Brahm sort of said, about letting go of some of the distinctions between different traditions and putting those things aside and just listening to the people in front of us, regardless of where they come from, can put us in this position where we can actually sit down and have a real, genuine, meaningful conversation. And as a result, I think it gives us the opportunity then to just hear the other person, set aside our preconceptions about what might they think or what might they have to say, or based on where they're coming from. And I think if we can hear each other honestly in that sense, we then have a real opportunity to learn from each other. And in learning from each other, I think we can then work together. Because if you start off thinking, oh, we're fundamentally different, we have different beliefs about what happens when we die or what happened before we got here, and that's where you start from, then you fundamentally start as opposition. If you come to the table and just say, look, we're both human beings, we're flawed, we have ideas, they're potentially different ideas, but that doesn't matter. We're just going to have a conversation, to listen to each other, ask each other questions, and try to figure out where we go from here. And I think in that process, that there's so much potential. There's so much potential to work together to solve these big problems. And it doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be grand gestures. It can be very small gestures. But ultimately, I think of it, as planting these seeds and then cultivating them, watering them, and watering not just our own potted plants and our own seeds, but those around us, right? Otherwise, they may not. We have to share. They may not have the water that we do, the resources that we do. And so, to me, I think very fundamentally, I think we have to take each other seriously. We have to listen to each other. And I think that sort of is often one of the biggest sources of us not being able to solve these problems is we approach it fundamentally from me and mine and my tribe and my religion or my background, and without an opening to the other.
Thank you. And in terms of next steps, we have a couple of slides for the audience to kind of have some ideas about, where to from here as well. So if you'd like to contribute, we've got a couple of ideas first for the meditation practice and then for the research. So the Buddhist Society of Victoria, with the support of Ajahn Brahm and the Newbury Buddhist Monastery, are actually in the process of building a rather wonderful facilities in a meditation retreat centre that will be in Newbury, which is not far from Melbourne. less than an hour and a half from Melbourne, I believe, time-wise. And this will be a low-cost place where individuals of all, religions can come and visit and learn meditation or attend a meditation retreat. So this will be a wonderful facility, and funds have certainly been raised so far. Building approvals currently have been submitted to the council, and all going well, we hope to start construction in the middle of 2021. So this is such a great project, and if you'd like to support the project, you can follow the link here. Perhaps we could also put it in the chat, the bsv.net.au, to support this project. And also meditation. If you'd like to contribute to the science of meditation, you're invited to participate in a large study that is Nicholas is the senior researcher on. So to participate in the study, you can see the link here. It's bit.ly/358STFM. Perhaps we can also put that in the chat. Then you can contribute quite directly to the science of mindfulness. Also, if you'd like to contribute or interested in donating to the science of contemplative practice through the University of Melbourne, you could email brooke.disney@unimelb.edu.au for opportunities to support this research and to build these collaborations between Buddhist organisations and psychological scientists. One last thing I wanted to mention, I'm involved with the Sakyadhita International Association of Buddhist Women, and we have a large conference will be occurring in December of 2021. And so you can submit a paper for that, an academic paper, or also even from personal experience paper. Submissions close at the end of January 2021. So to learn more about the Sakyadhita conferences that are truly quite awe-inspiring, under the guidance of Jetsuma Tenzin Palmo, who's a very inspiring female Buddhist leader, you can visit the Sakyadhita website to learn more about that. So those are all of the messages. So I'd like to really extend a deep thanks to Ajahn Brahm and Nicholas for joining us here today. I think it's been a very enriching conversation. Just the beginning, I think, of a conversation we could continue over the months and years to come, I hope. Great gratitude for your time to be here, to both of you.
You're welcome.
Audience, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.